It's my pleasure now to introduce you to Regional Chief Isadore Day, who's going to speak next. Ontario Regional Chief Isadore Day is from Serpent River First Nation. His main focus at all tables with government is First Nations rights, health, social, economies, infrastructure, quality of life, and overall nationhood based on all facets of what a nation embodies. So please help me welcome Regional Chief Isadore Day.
Miigwech, Barry. Bujo, Ani, Sego, Segoli, good morning. Ke get Senachin and Dagweg, Mungwang, Mungpi, Nungwa, Nishke, Winge, Winwayawat. I first of all want to acknowledge the Creator, creation, prayers, and the protocols. I want to acknowledge Elder Sioux and the territory of the Mississaugas and the people and the nations that have traveled on these waters of Toronto for thousands of years. My name is Isadore Day. I'm the Ontario Regional Chief. My Anishinaabe name is Gwisquimigasinene, and my speaking notes will mention that the name that I carry is Windatagonene. And Windatagonene is my great-great-great-great-grandfather who signed the Robinson-Huron Treaty. And his father was Genebek, who fought in the War of 1812, and he also signed the Bondhead Treaty in Manitoulin. So just a few things before I get started. I first of all want to acknowledge the IOG, Paul, MF, Barry, and I just wanted to say that it's quite an impressive agenda, and I want to congratulate the IOG for its very important work in the area of governance, and more particular, the nation-to-nation discussion. I want to acknowledge my friend and colleague, Minister Zimmer from Ontario, send my regards to the Premier as well, and your colleagues. Just to note as well, Minister Bennett went to New Zealand just a couple weeks ago, and both times we weren't invited, and I'm wondering why. They must have some secrets over there that we don't know about just yet. But I think one of the things that they may not have mentioned or that they focus on somewhat when they talk about Maori rights is the participation in the Maori government and parliament that they have over there. That's a deciding leverage that the Maori have in terms of moving their issues forward. I just want to go through some things here. And first of all, let me say that if I seem a little bit slow on the uptake here, I probably am. I didn't get much sleep last night. I stayed at the en route mobile motel last night. Chief McCready knows what that's all about, being a chief, and knowing that sometimes you travel a lot in this work as a First Nation leader. But I wanted to share with you a little bit of my person, because I have a priority in my life these days. My number one priority, yes, I'm Regional Chief for Ontario, and yes, I'm a family man, but my number one priority is the Treehouse, Project Treehouse. And if some of you see me online, you'll see that I have now my 23rd update, my 6th weekend of the treehouse that I'm building for my daughters. And I share that with you as my opening point, because I was thinking this morning, how can I tie and transition the slumber that I'm still in a little bit here, and still coming off of a pretty intense weekend at the treehouse. And I can only tell you that I thought about what was important. First of all, foundation, process, tools, and ownership. And I tell you that, and I'll give you just a short experience. So when I first decided that I was going to build this treehouse, I had a big rubble of trash, and there was some trees around it, and I knew I needed to get this done in springtime. So we cleared it out, and I said, well, I'm going to finally do this treehouse. This was about 6 weeks ago or so. And what I felt was so important was the foundation. Like, I had to do this thing right. I could have just tied it into the trees, but I made sure that I put the proper foundation in. and ensured that it was going to hold the weight, because I knew that I was going to build quite a treehouse. It was originally just a small thing, but it turned out to be a 12 by 16 foot treehouse, and it's a little home, and if I ever have to move in there, I can do so. But I really put some thought into this, and being a previous life, I was in the Carpenters Union at quite a young age, at 21 years old. I knew a little bit about carpentry. So I also thought, well, I don't have a lot of tools because I've been a chief for quite a while, so I thought, okay, I can go to the second-hand store or garage sales and buy tools, but you know what happens when you buy crappy tools? You usually end up paying for it. So I figured, well, I'm gonna get good tools, not really expensive tools, but I purchased as I went along, and I'm so glad that I did, because it just made for a smooth transition. The process as well also became important for me, and I'm doing this as a weekend job, spending time with family, traveling as regional chief, and I'm noticing that I really have to plan things out. So I do little blueprints, and the process for me is one where I'm efficient, effective, and economical with my time and with my money, and it's going pretty good so far. But the last piece on the ownership is, I had an interesting discussion with my 6-year-old Wasea before I left home last night, and she talked about the door, because we don't have the door on yet, and she said, do I get to pick the color of the door? I said, absolutely, sweetie. And she said, well, I want it to be a rainbow color, so I'm going to have to figure out how to do this rainbow color. But she said that she wants the name Treehouse on the door. And I thought about that this morning, and I thought how important it is for us when we have something, when something is either granted and we claim ownership of it, that we have to have this sense of ownership. And for her, it's going to be so important that she has a rainbow-colored door and that it says Treehouse on it. So that's what's going to happen. All in all, to say that I left home quite late last night, and I traveled here early this morning. So that's where it's at. And I want to lay that because I think there's an important storyline there for me that helps me understand a little better what I'm tasked to do here today. So the other set of things that I'd like to say before I get going is that we have a lot of very impressive speakers, folks, colleagues, and people that I've known for quite some time. I know, Paul, you and I sit on a Ryerson Indigenous Council with Pam Palmer. We haven't met for years, but we're still colleagues in that sense. But I just looked at the agenda here, and I noticed that there are a number of people that are the who's who and really who have a lot to contribute to the nation-to-nation discussion. Also, before I get moving, I want to acknowledge all the sacred items and acknowledge the protocols, because as I discuss who I am as a treaty person, I also am gravitated towards the discussions that my friend and colleague Minister Zimmer raised, and that we're all treaty people. As we move forward in the discourse of our rights and First Nations authority and jurisdiction, there's also another piece, and I know Ovid McCready will speak volumes about this. Much of his work as a former national chief and chief in his territory, there's a thing that we can use as a metaphor called the treaty blanket. And as our ancestors descended upon the treaty blanket and we proceeded to make treaty, we left there. And yes, Minister, we were all treaty people, but there's something that is inherent and at the foundation of that. It's that there is still the settler-indigenous relationship, and that prior to contact, we had something that we never gave away, our inherent rights and authority. And that First Nation jurisdiction is something that is very legitimate and at the foundation and at the outset of the treaty relationship. So yes, we're all treaty people, and although we struggle in that, we're becoming very keen and very aware of what precedes that is the sovereignty and the inherent rights and jurisdiction that we have as First Nation people. And I think we're getting to the point of having to recognize and understand that we need to operationalize that within the relationship now. And I think that's part and parcel of what this is all about. So I will carry on and carry forward. I do have a number of notes here. We will provide those for you. I'm going to jump all over the place here a bit. I realize that I have an hour, but I'm probably going to give you a few because you started a little bit late here. So I'm going to see what I can do here over the next 40 minutes. Important to also note that while I worked in construction and commercial fishing and the social work field, I was also community chief in the Serpent River for 10 years, and as well I sat as the vice chair of the Tribal Council of the North Shore. As well, I was the Grand Chief of the Lake Huron region, which is the Robinson-Huron Territory and the Anishinaabe Nation Territory. This topic, therefore, is one of great importance to me as the regional chief, but of interest as I've grown to learn a lot about the fiscal fuel in the tank and financial investment and the annuities of the treaties and our relationship and why it's so important to move beyond the colonial relationship of the Indian Act and to a much greater sense of First Nation determined governments. My topic today is on fiscal relations and the urgent need to develop and implement a new funding system for First Nations. As it stands right now, far too many of our communities are managing their misery. Far too many of our peoples live in third world poverty. The solution is simple. First Nations need to break the chains of the Indian Act and end bureaucratic dysfunction that delays that are killing our people. We need long-term transfer payments to our communities and organizations. Most importantly, we need to develop our own authorities and institutions, from health to education, from housing to infrastructure. We need the resources to govern ourselves. So I've got two sets of 4 points that I would like to cast out here as I get into my discussion and ask you to keep these in mind. So the first set of 4 points are: one, we need to dismantle the Indian Act. We know this. We hear a lot about it. It's almost become rhetorical, but the reality is we need to deal with the Indian Act. Second point, we need to build our own authorities and institutions. Clearly, every First Nation on this land and those that are, trying to be Indians, because people are still trying to be Indians, right? They're dealing ultimately with the impediment of authorities and institutions that govern their lives, and we declare unlawfully. The third point, to transfer bureaucracies to First Nation control. We've heard that in the opening remarks. We'll get into that a little deeper. And the fourth point is, we become the deliverologist for our peoples. And again, I think it's an important concept in school of thought. The deliverology is one that we match, how well are the investments that were promised and the commitments, the political commitments, and how well are our governments moving on that. We know, look at the 2% cap. I think the debate is still out there. Has it really changed? What has happened to transfer, to change from a 2% cap going back to 1996 to a much better outcome for our people fiscally? So what are we doing? The Chiefs of Ontario have a vision. We are working on things. My job is not, I'm not a rights holder now as the regional chief, but my job is to help coordinate that discussion and dialogue, which when I met with MF and the folks at IOG, I was quite pleased and delighted to be part of this process, because it's where it's at. This is where we're going to see lives change, is being able to change the fundamentals and the underpinnings of the relationship. So what is the Chiefs of Ontario vision? First, to create a First Nation Management Board. I think it's really, really important to recognize when you talk about the public service branch, whether it's in Ontario or the federal government, we know that there's standards and there's always an ongoing effort to make things better, to maintain a level of standard. We need to do that for First Nations, and that can't be done through a colonial government process. We need that management system. We need that management board. We need to do that on our own. So that's the first point. The second point is we need to create our own community funding models. I think it's important to underscore and draw our attention back to the treaties, back to the economies within our territories. Why do the resources, taxes and royalties go back to consolidated funds, whether it be in the province or the federal government? I think that there's some opportunity to create a fiscal mechanism to make sure that that gets closer to the ground. The third point is we need to create our own First Nation capital reserve. And again, it's the age-old problem of access to capital being a problem. And we see that when there is access to capital and when we have our own steam and our own authority to advance our economies, it works. There are scores of folks around the country in our First Nation communities that once we resolve the issue of capital, things change. Life gets better. The fourth point is we need to create a new governance structure for the authority of a new fiscal relationship, and it must come from our communities. Again, this whole issue of the fiscal relationship, we're now discussing this at the AFN level, and I only come into that discussion with some optimism, but it's clearly balanced and tempered by a cautious optimism. I'm very cautious that government promises and commitments often lead us down a path of from one government tenure to the next, and we're never able to see any real change. So we need to change those things. And when we look at those challenges, First Nations in Ontario are clearly asking us at the Chiefs of Ontario to coordinate a dialogue and discussion, which is why I'm here. Just a few decades later, just going through a little bit of a history, talking about the First Peoples here, and I'm gonna rush ahead a little bit. During the 1700s, the Mississauga Ojibwe began trading with the British and the French on the shores of Lake Huron. In fact, a trading post at Port Credit was partly built with the assistance of the Ojibwe. And I think it's important to go back to the importance of history. We see that the historical context that's been taught in schools up to this point in the last, say, 5 years or so, the movement of the Truth and Reconciliation, that Canadians have not known the real history of our people. There's an interesting book called Accounting for Genocide. Mr. Newlove did the forward in it. It's a really interesting book because it talks about the history of our people and the colonial policies of the government of Canada and how they were designed to actually disenfranchise, to take us away from our own focus and our own authority of our own financial management systems. And it's really important to recognize that when the settlers came here, that there was almost an outcry, and there was a relationship based on the settlers needing help from us, and we greatly stepped forward and we helped this country, and its fur trading history was built on the backs of our people. So I'm going to go forward a little bit and talk about a little bit of the rights and the Royal Proclamation. It was important to convene a treaty gathering of more than 120 tribes surrounding the Great Lakes in what is now considered to be British territory by Europeans of the day. The 1764 Treaty of Niagara was an important historic gathering to comply with previous arranged Indigenous protocols of peace and friendship. We were informed of the Royal Proclamation in terms of our generous than those terms that have been interpreted by courts in the last 150 years. We speak about the Turo Wampum. I was very happy to hear a discussion about that relationship. The Turo Wampum informs us of the original understanding of nation to nation. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People and the Truth and Reconciliation recommendations to implement UNDRIP all bring us back to that place in time when the treaty at Niagara guaranteed a better relationship. And again, very important, you may have seen a couple of historical clips where I was carrying the 1764 Treaty of Niagara belt. Very important teaching that I was given by the elders in the Anishinaabe Nation on that relationship and the sovereignty that was declared at the time of the Treaty of Niagara. In less than a month, on July 1st, Canada will officially celebrate the 150th year of Confederation. It is very safe to say that the vast majority of First Nation people will not be celebrating. It's a very common theme, very common sentiment, and I must also say that while I think your organization, Canadians for a New Partnership, is a very strong agenda, I think the departure for me, and I did declare this when when your organization first came out, I had a little bit of a challenge calling myself a Canadian, so I couldn't gravitate towards Canadians for a New Partnership because I don't see myself as a Canadian. With all due respect, it's really the work and the relationship to make that relationship between settlers and Indigenous people better, and know that the Canadian experience has to do with that very thing. So I think the essence of the mandate and the personality of your organization is there. Since the now 140-year-old Indian Act, we have been treated as wards of the state. We are First Nations who are considered as second afterthoughts on government policy and priorities, and treated as third-class citizens, some of whom live in fourth world conditions. In 1974, BC First Nation leader George Manuel coined the phrase and the title of his book, The Fourth World, An Indian Reality. It describes the struggles taken up by our peoples to reclaim the riches in our traditional territories that had been deprived from us. For the most part, that struggle continues today. When Canada celebrated its 100th anniversary in 1967, the Governor-General of Canada opened up the centennial session of Parliament with a speech from the throne that spoke to this country's identity as being English and French. Let me quote in its entirety what the Governor-General did say in reference to Indigenous peoples during the May 8th, 1967 speech from the throne. Greater emphasis and encouragement consist with the federal responsibilities will be given to community development programs throughout Canada. The next sentence reads, in no case is the need for these more fully demonstrated than in the case of the Indians and the Eskimos of Canada, who face grave problems in their attempts to share the benefits and opportunities of our society. The government will therefore put before the Centennial Session amendments to the Indian Act, and it will take other administrative measures to encourage the process of community development for the benefit of the Indian and Eskimo people. End quote. That is a total reference to the Indigenous peoples. I have no idea what community development programs were established to help out the poor Indians and Eskimos of the day. But let me tell you what is happening to our people today who 50 years later are still not sharing in the benefits and opportunities of our society, to quote the Governor-General. Last Friday, the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal ruled for the third time that Canada has failed to comply with the orders to provide basic levels of health care to First Nation children in Canada. Quite simply, we have children suffering and dying from preventable illness. In January, two 12-year-old girls from Wapakika First Nation in Northern Ontario committed suicide. The mental health and suicide prevention funding that the community has enjoyed for several decades was cut off last year. And I just want to note something here, because I think it's important to make the distinction that while we sometimes hear of this horrible tragedy of suicide of First Nation children in our communities, Canadians may or may not think that there's the odd time that you see First Nation kids committing suicide. But I need to tell you that there are some that come out in the media and say, this is what's happening, this is what happened, this is what our community is dealing with today. But I need to tell you that there are far more that you don't hear about. And while sometimes the issue of suicide may become like it's become a political issue and it's politicized, I need to tell you that so many of our communities deal with this, and they don't speak about it. So the numbers are far greater than what you hear in the media. So the atrocities are far more intense than maybe what even Canada knows about. So it's important to make that distinction. We have a welfare state system that renders far too many of our communities dependent upon funding that sometimes never shows up in time. Our leaders, our people, our children feel helpless and powerless. So how do we restart the relationship? The solutions are there. In the 1996 Royal Commission on Aboriginal People report, it's still a benchmark that has all the solutions. which boil down to self-government and a sufficient land base for economic self-sufficiency. In Ontario in 2007, the IPRWASH report practically repeats many of the same RCAP recommendations. However, one of the most important IPRWASH recommendations is that Ontario implement resource revenue sharing. The Quebec Cree are already at the next level of self-governance and wealth generation through resource revenue sharing. This is the conversation that First Nation leaders in Ontario and across the country must have with their provincial premiers. Since last year, the conversation on resource revenue sharing has begun in earnest here in Ontario. However, there's still some very important and tangible movement that needs to be made. I fear that we are moving into election mode in the Ontario province, and others know that a lot of the resource revenue sharing success, it only happens when governments are stable in the provinces and territories. So we definitely need to look at this one very closely. Indeed, Premier Wynne has made the commitment to implement government resource revenue sharing, hopefully before the end of this year. The resource industry is fully supportive of resource revenue sharing. In fact, Ernst & Young, or EY, has been working on a government resource revenue sharing report that will be submitted to the province in the very near future. I've been told that the research of EY acknowledges that enhancing engagement with and participation of Indigenous communities in the resource development sector will demand a range of provincial policies and initiatives. Two critical steps in pursuing successful adoption and implementation of this development of a business case and a collaborative model for negotiating such agreements with Indigenous communities. I'd just like to stop here for a second because, we've got former Chief Joe Muskokaman who often talks about the reality and the kind of the missed boat theory, if you will. He says that many of the communities that have been developed, say in southern Ontario, where there is no Crown land, where there is no development, what do you do there? I have to say that there's outstanding issues in the relationship, and I think that resource revenue sharing has to go a little deeper. And I believe that there's something to be said about the taxation and the royalties and the commerce of more developed areas. I think resource revenue sharing is far more complex than just the resource extraction and the benefits from that particular model. I believe resource revenue sharing is a much greater discussion that needs to become a lot more entrenched. Through collaborative design and co-design, for short, all parties can bring a fundamentally different approach to traditional relationships. Co-design is a process of working together to achieve shared outcomes, to build trust, to gain new insights, to move from protracted quid pro quo discussions to collectively acting in our shared interest. At the end of the day, done right with the commitment of all parties involved, it can significantly accelerate achieving the resource revenue sharing outcomes that we all benefit from. So again, I think it's really important when you look at this study, I'm inferring here that the engagement is going to be far different, okay? I'm going to say it again, and I'll tell my friend and colleague, Minister Zimmer, and federal counterparts, this theme of nothing about us without us needs to take foothold now. If we're going to see a new relationship and much better outcomes, we have to be at the table at all parts of the process. We have a Prime Minister who told the AFN chiefs in the Assembly over a year and a half ago that the 2% cap on core and basic funding would be immediately lifted. This has yet to happen. We have a 2016 federal budget that promises an additional $8.4 billion to First Nations over 5 years. The 2017 budget promised an additional $3.5 billion. So far, the money is not flowing to any substantive level. We have Indigenous and Northern Affairs Canada, as of last week, sent back $900 million in unspent funding last year. That same department has still not complied with the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal ruling to provide an additional $155 million in child welfare funding. We have a First Nation Inuit health branch that spends millions of dollars on lawyers to deny basic health services. FNIHB also ignored Wapakika's plea for $340,000 in suicide prevention program funding last year. Apparently, it was an awkward time in the funding cycle. And I just want to note that I don't buy that either, because when the suicides were happening and I stood in front of the standing committee on this issue, we put an off-budget cycle request in for $140 million. And in my discussions with the minister and some folks in Privy Council, the turnaround did happen, and we were able to achieve $69 million, half of what we wanted. But it shows that, you know, when the pressure's there, when the work is done, when we sit down and we talk about these issues seriously and in a committed way, this does happen. So, you know, we need to keep doing this work. We have children who are growing up with rotten teeth and a lack of self-esteem, all because bureaucrats in Ottawa are nickel and diming and delaying and denying what would be considered routine treatment for mainstream Canadian children. Last October, I met with the Ontario Federal Council here in Toronto. For those of you who don't know, these are bureaucrats who control the funding and the relations for First Nations in Ontario. Council members included INAC Regional Director, the President of the Ontario Federation of Economic Development, the agency, Intergovernmental Relations and Partnerships, and External Relations. I told them that we are finally working as equals on a nation-to-nation and government basis where our treaties and jurisdiction are respected and enforced. At least this is how it looks on paper in the minister's mandate letters and in the billions of dollars in new funding promised in the last two federal budgets. However, the reality is a different story. Our leaders and our community members have yet to see any of these fine words and commitments translated into funding and action on the ground. Perhaps one of the biggest problems is the fact that that there are so many critical areas that need to be improved as quickly as possible. Major investments are needed in child welfare, clean water, proper housing, education, and simply eradicating poverty and despair. Poverty and despair are directly results. Poverty and despair directly results in the missing and murdered statistics. Poverty and despair also directly results in stolen childhoods and children who take their lives. It directly results in homeless and the astronomical rates of our people in prisons and in jails. 2 decades of the 2% cap funding, which amounts to a loss of approximately $30 billion to First Nation communities, has resulted in a very big hole of the poverty and despair that we need to climb out of right now. First Nation lives cannot be treated like lines in a budget to be addressed in the fiscal year 2019 and 2020. We cannot lose another child to suicide. We cannot lose another child to a group home in a far-flung city. We cannot lose another family to a fatal house fire in a home that would be condemned in mainstream Canada. Rebuilding and repairing the nation-to-nation relationship is not simply a matter of clawing our way to the top of the federal provincial budget cycles year in and year out. Drastic changes must be made in the current relationship, beginning with the making of a current bureaucracy responsible and responsive to our needs. We can no longer be treated as second or third-class citizens. We will no longer tolerate the adversarial approach that still seems to dominate the bureaucratic mindset. We must finally become equal partners in this 150-year-old confederation that begun with 4 provinces in 1867. We must finally restore the treaty relationship when we are treated as equals with the newcomers 250 years ago. A significant step toward restarting the relationship begins with breaking the cycle of poverty by establishing long-term sustainable funding, as promised by the Prime Minister. It begins with breaking the cycle of dependence by moving towards self-government and self-sustaining economies. Today, we are still in the process of internally rebuilding our organizations, whether it's the Assembly of First Nations, the Chiefs of Ontario, and the Anishinaabe Nation, the Association of Iroquois and Allied Indians, and so on right across the country. But I must also note we do have other organizations like Matawa Tribal Council that is represented here today. Very important institutions that are very much part of our history, but also should be part of our future in the nation-to-nation relationship. I remain confident that this current federal government is committed to following through on its mandate with Indigenous people, but we need the bureaucracy to act at the speed of 21st century deliverology, not at the pace of 19th century colonialism. We must begin now and turn the corner on eradicating poverty and despair. We must begin now by rebuilding at the community level, and we must also offer hope so our children no longer contemplate suicide. Our children must be able to see a bright future where they are masters of their own destiny. Our children must be empowered to become contributors and protectors of their families, their languages, their cultures, and their lands. Our children must be able to prepare a future where they are the leaders and professionals in happy, healthy communities. Our children will be the deliverologists in their own communities. Once we gain back control of our communities through self-governance and self-sustaining economies, only then will we finally become equals. Only then will we finally secure our rightful place in Canada. Again, I want to offer this, that, you know, as I talked about in my opening comments, you know, a strong foundation, the process, the right tools, and ownership. For me, that's what resonates the most. And, you know, as I took the time this past weekend and I was through the labor of love for my kids, thinking about their future, I wonder what life will be like for them. And I wonder if I somehow, by example in the work that I'm doing, to show them how to do things right, and you prepare a place, and you take the time and you invest appropriately, and ultimately, you know, that my daughters see this as theirs. I really think that really is the most important storyline for me here going forward. We have a lot of work to do. You know, aside from everything that I spoke about, I must tell you that the one thing that we didn't highlight a lot in the notes today was the importance of our culture and our community. You see, I think that there's something to be said about our people being able to sustain themselves, to be able to survive, you know, since time immemorial, you know, to travel vast, brutal landscapes, and to be able to carry on from one generation to the next with language, with culture, with the sense of pride. You know, and I think that has a lot to do with our culture and our languages. And I think that part of this must also recognize that, you know, in the codification of our own sense of efficacy, political efficacy, I think we find that in our cultural identity and our languages, and I think that we can't miss the boat there, which I think is one of the main reasons why, you know, our chiefs and our elders are being very pointed about the importance of our culture and language. So I think that's another piece I think that can be worked into this. I again want to thank the IOG and MF and folks for your efforts and the work that we're doing at the Chiefs of Ontario. Just very quickly, the vision is there, but we're finding it's important to continue to be at the table. We sit at the AFN level. I'm an executive member there, and we're continually discussing these issues and bilateral with Canada, fiscal relations, the law and policy review. These are things that our executive is talking about. But I think we have to drill down even further, and we need to get to the history of who we are, and we have to go back to the relationship, and we have to correct some of those things, and we have to dispel some of the myths that exist about who we are and what our rights are and what our authorities are. Ultimately, we are responsible. And once that door opens up and we can create those institutions, I think life will get better for our people. So again, thank you to the IOG, and I'm going to listen intently to the outcomes of the nation-to-nation dialogue. I think we've got work to do, and I don't think this is just chatter. I think we're in a good time, and we're in desperate times as well. But I think we've got everything we need to get the job done, and we'll claim ownership at the end of all this. So thank you very much, and good morning.